I did a series a while ago on Pianoteq, and today I want to add to that and talk more about how I approach it as a technician and also explain more of what I do as a piano tuner or piano technician and how that relates to using this software, using digital pianos. But for those of you who are primarily acoustic piano players, there should be some interesting stuff here about the way pianos work. And for those of you who are just digital piano users, I think this will also be very relevant to you. As one commenter pointed out, in my last series, I spent a lot more time talking about the plugin than my job as a piano tuner. So today I wanted to talk about that and give you some insight into how a piano works and how we can use that to improve digital piano performance and recording. In this video, I'm going to talk about tuning, voicing, regulation, the interface, which is the digital piano, as well as a little bit about recording, because I also do have, obviously, experience recording digitally, as well as working in a lot of studios with recording engineers and seeing how they mic up pianos, so I can shed some insight into studio recording as well. For those of you who may be new to Pianoteq, it is a physical modeling software, not a sample library, and the difference is that a sample library is recorded with a bunch of different recordings of different velocities of each note and then compiled into a virtual instrument, all based on a real piano. So if the piano's not in tune, the sample library won't be in tune, whereas physical modeling allows us to virtually recreate that like a synthesizer and recreate the sound and timbre of an instrument, as well as change all the parameters of it, change the tuning, change the dimensions of the soundboard, the string length, all the important things that go into designing an instrument, as well as getting the sound you want for your recordings. And I really like that flexibility as a technician. I like being able to go in and tweak the tuning or tweak the hardness of the hammers or the mic placement. I think that's all very interesting, so I really like the software for that reason, and it was developed by a piano technician as well, so that just goes to show that we like fiddling with things, I guess. Let's take a look at how a piano action works. This is an action model for an upright or vertical piano. There's quite a few things going on when you actually press a key. We can see that the hammer strikes the string. This block of wood is our string. We can see the damper moves and lifts off the string. The hammer is thrown at the string and does not stay in contact with it. That can happen. That's an issue. It's called blocking. If the hammer stays in contact with the string, it's going to block the string from ringing out, and so you're going to have a dead note. You're just going to hear it for a brief second. So the hammer has to bounce off the string and then rest at a good position. This piece here is the back check. That keeps the hammer from moving too far back off the string. This whole contraption is called the whip-in, and it looks different on a grand piano, but it lifts up, and you can see this jack moves out of the way. That is controlled by the let-off button, and then it has a spring under it to return it to its position. And this allows us to play fast repeated notes. The damper, which is this piece of felt here, rests on the strings to silence them when they're not being played, and lifts off when the note is being played so that it can ring out, and it will stay up as long as you hold the key, and it will return when you release the key. The spoon pushes the damper lever out of the way while the note is being played. The key is just a large wooden bar, and it's just a simple lever. The balance rail here runs across the length of the entire keyboard, and there's a pin in it, a couple pins that keep the key from shifting side to side and allow it to move freely. I don't have a full grand piano action model, but this is a whip-in, a Steinway whip-in. On a grand piano, the hammers lie on their backs like this, so they are aided by gravity. When they strike the strings from underneath, they fall back down, meaning a grand piano can have slightly faster repetition, and it's a slightly more efficient design, which is one benefit of a grand piano. Here are some more upright action parts from a different piano. This is an older design. You see these very large turn-of-the-century saloon upright pianos. These older uprights were so tall that they needed these stickers to help get the action high enough so that the strings can be struck at the right point along their length. This model is fairly representative of the size of most modern upright actions, but you will see some older pianos with even smaller actions, like spinets, which are a whole different issue. The action actually goes below the keys and is pulled up by a wire. Those are a nightmare to work on, and the pianos don't sound very good, so just avoid spinet pianos. There are sometimes small consoles that have a miniature action that can be decent, but the quality of a piano's sound is largely dependent on the length of its strings, and so the smaller your piano is, the smaller the sound is, the weaker the bass will be, and sometimes there will be compromises to the action. So having a full-sized action like this on upright is pretty important, and thankfully most pianos of the last few decades have abandoned smaller actions, and they just are rare to see. There's a lot that can be said about tuning pianos, and I'm not going to get too into some of the technical stuff, but we use a tool called a tuning hammer. Here is my personal hammer, as well as another I have on hand, to show that they do come in different sizes, and you can get different sized tips. You can customize a lot of the things about your tuning hammer for your own preferences and style. It is essentially a wrench. It's not all that dissimilar from a drum key, but piano strings are under a great deal of pressure, and so you need good leverage as well as control for fine tuning. Unlike something like a guitar that has geared tuners where one turn will only be a 20th of the turn of the actual string, with a tuning hammer it is a one-to-one relationship, and so you can very easily throw a string way out of tune or tune it up so far that the string breaks. So you have to be careful, and it takes a lot of experience and practice to get good with using a tuning hammer so that you can tune quickly and efficiently and accurately. Another question I get sometimes is, do I have perfect pitch? And no, I definitely do not. I think I have a better sense of pitch than most people, but as far as just telling you what any random note is off the top of my head, I might be able to be close, but probably not exact all the time. It's not a necessary skill for a piano tuner, and I think there's some misconceptions around perfect pitch, and it really can mean different things. I don't think that most people with perfect pitch are going to get within a cent or two of exactly where it needs to be. I use an electronic tuner. Essentially, I set one note to the tuner, to an electronic tuner, and then I do the other unisons by ear. And so it is a mixture of tuning by ear and tuning with a digital tuner. Oral tuning, or purely auditory tuning, is usually done with a tuning fork as a reference, so you still do have a bass line, and you could set an entire octave with a whole octave of tuning forks, or you can use a single tuning fork, or maybe two or three, to get a few important notes and then build intervals by listening to the beat rate of different intervals. Any two notes are going to beat off each other. Can't say that. I think there can be a certain level of mysticism in all things creative and artistic, and I don't really view tuning pianos as an artistic endeavor. There's certainly a lot of craft and skill involved. There are artistic choices you can make as to voicing in terms of how hard or soft you want the hammers to be, how bright you think the piano should be, or how dark it should be. That can be a choice made by the client or the tuner to help the piano sound as good as possible. And so there is some artistic discretion in there. But as far as setting the notes to certain pitches, I view that as a mechanical and more scientific or mathematical task of getting the piano to be in tune. In reality, tuning a piano takes years of practice and experience. In Pianoteq, it's very easy. If the piano is out of tune, all we have to do is decrease the unison width back to normal. Simple. Now, we can play with the unison width to increase the amount of chorusy out of tuneness it has, and unlike a real piano, when you adjust the unison width in Pianoteq, it's very even across the board, so you can get more of that chorusy sound without it being random. When a piano actually goes out of tune, the strings don't all go out of tune evenly, and so it sounds extra bad. Here, we can just get some extra flavor with the unison width if you want that, or you can even tighten it up. The default is at 1. I find that for my taste, sometimes lowering that, if I want it to be really dead on in tune, You don't want to go all the way to 0, but maybe around 60 to 90 if the 1.0 level is not quite as tight of a tuning as you'd like. When I tune a piano, I want to get the strings as close to each other as possible, because over the course of playing it, they will get more out of tune. I want it to be as close to perfect when I'm done so that it stays in tune that much longer. And if it's being used on a record, studios and high-level players really don't want it to be too chorusy and out of tune sounding. That's why they hire me. So I try to get it super accurate. So I'm not going to intentionally make it sound a little bit out of tune for flavor unless someone requested it, which they never have. So I like to keep it maybe even a little under 1 if I want it to sound like it's just been freshly tuned and it's, you know, a nice studio piano that holds its tune well. In Pianoteq, we can also change the temperament and the bass frequency at the touch of a button, which is cool and sometimes maybe useful. I've never been requested to tune to a different temperament. I know that sometimes for historical performances, especially on harpsichord, that may be done. But for modern recordings or people's pianos at home, we use equal temperament, and that works just fine. The bass frequency, I do occasionally tune at 442 hertz for certain ensembles that have instruments that can't be easily tuned, like the bandoneon in particular. I'm also a bagpiper, and the bagpipes are another folk instrument where they are at A whatever they feel like that day. Anywhere from maybe A465 up to A490 on a bad day. So that is an instrument that is tuned to itself and to each other. But you don't really see bagpipes playing with pianos or orchestras that often. And when they do, they often have to do a whole lot of special work to get that to be in tune. But regardless, we can do that very easily here if we want to change the bass frequency. Going from 440 to 441 would be 4 cents sharp, and 442 would be 8 cents sharp above 440, and likewise going flat. So that is a cool feature to have that you can play with if you want. We can also go into the advanced tuning window here and play around with custom temperaments. We can simply drag these points and create new temperaments if you want. It's probably not going to sound very good. But if you do a careful job, you could perhaps make your own temperament that's cool, or you can choose from any number of other historical and other temperaments and even load them from other people if they come up with custom temperaments. We do apply octave stretching to instruments, and that depends on the length of the instrument, and that can be measured as well as far as what level of octave stretching will sound best on the instrument. But the general rule is that the longer the strings are, the nicer the piano is, the bigger the piano is, the less you need to stretch the octaves. And what that stretch is simply making the bass flatter and the treble sharper. And that's done on a curve across the whole keyboard, and that can again be calculated by a digital tuner. And we're talking small degrees, nothing hugely dramatic. It's not going to change the low C to a B, for example, but we might be talking as much as 20 or 30 cents on the lowest notes, 20 or 30 cents flat, and maybe 20 or 30 cents sharp on the highest notes. However, on a nicer piano, a concert grand or a semi-concert grand, you're probably looking more at a range of about 10 cents. So it's mild, but it does help the whole instrument to sound more in tune with itself because of the harmonics and overtones of different string lengths. And there's plenty of complex stuff that goes into it, but that's the gist of what octave stretching is and why we do it. The last tuning option is octave stretching, and as I mentioned, this really depends on the piano, and a nicer piano is going to be stretched less because the strings are going to be in better tune with each other in terms of overtones than a smaller piano will. So on a concert instrument, we will stretch less than on a very small spinet piano. In the context of Pianoteq, I usually just leave it default, but you could increase or decrease the stretch. If you're doing something like we're changing the string length, say we want to make this piano much smaller, we could change the string length. In that case, you might want to increase the octave stretching. You can go by ear and check the octaves and hear that stretching. If it's really dramatic, you can hopefully hear this high C now. It's quite noticeably sharper than middle C. That's more stretching than would ever be done on a real piano, but that is something you could play around with. You can also decrease it, though only so much. And that should make it, I suppose, more in tune, but the point of octave stretching is to make it sound more in tune. And it's a complex relationship between the overtones, the fundamentals, and how we perceive things. So you can play around with it, but the default is fine. It's set that way for a reason. I would assume, and I'm not sure about this, that the default octave stretch between different models of pianos may be slightly different. I don't know, because I don't know everything about how the software works on the back end. It's always set to the default of 1, but I don't know that the stretch doesn't change between models. However, I'm not sure. And most of the models in Pianoteq are concert and semi-concert grands. So those typically don't get a ton of stretching anyways. There is an upright model. Maybe on that it has a little more stretch. I'm not sure. Voicing is the process of making a piano's hammers softer or harder to make them either darker or brighter. And there's a lot of considerations with that. Typically when voicing, we're making the pianos softer by needling them, softening up the felt. A piano's hammers are constructed of multiple layers of very tightly stretched and wrapped felt. So here is a piano hammer. This is a bass hammer, and we can see this dark section in the center. That is a harder felt to keep the hammer intact and give it a rigid core. This is another hammer from a higher note. You can see it's smaller and it has pretty dramatic coloring back here. This is treated to stiffen the felt in the back to give more structural strength to the hammer. The felt on a piano hammer is actually stretched all the way around in one piece to create an extremely tight, intense hammer to give it strength and to give it flexibility, and so that hammers don't get destroyed really quickly, because they would. We can see on this hammer a little bit of wear from where the strings dug into the hammer. This one has pretty light wear. You can see it's still pretty round. Don't know if I have a really beat up hammer, but you can see where the strings dig into that and they wear away the felt over time. A really worn hammer will start to flatten out and have really deep grooves where the strings are, and that will make the hammer brighter. Piano hammers start out at their darkest and will get brighter as they age and wear. So typically I'm going back and darkening the hammers or loosening the felt on them a little bit to get them to be a little more flexible and softer again. This tool is a needler. These are just like sewing needles. There's several on them. With this tool, I can go in and loosen up the felt by stabbing it with little needles to make it softer. And depending on how aggressively you needle the hammers, you can get it to be a little darker or quite a bit darker, and it really depends on the condition of the hammers. A lot of this depends on the sound of the piano, the preferences of the client, as well as where it lives. Some pianos might naturally be darker or brighter, and you want to consider that when voicing. Sometimes in a particularly reflective room, like a very bright hall or someone's house, or I've seen some churches that don't have any acoustic treatment, and they have big open wood and glass spaces, those areas are already going to be bright and harsh rooms. So you may want the piano to be extra dark in a bright room. In a recording studio that has really great acoustic treatment, you may not want to make the piano too dark. You may want some of that extra brightness, and that may be treated with different microphones, placement, EQ. So really depends on the situation. There's no rule for voicing, and that is something where there's some creative input and also just judging the situation and the needs of the piano and the client. Voicing in Pianoteq is also very easy. It gives us 3 sliders for the voicing at different dynamic levels. What it allows us to do in the software, we could increase or decrease the dynamic range, the sort of spread of the voicing, so we could have it very soft at piano and very bright at forte, or we could bring these closer to the middle and have them be a tighter sort of voicing. Again, this isn't really something I think about when I'm voicing a piano in the real world, but the way it's done here is pretty simple, and we could also bring all these down. It would maybe be nice to have just a single slider, maybe in addition to this fine-tuning. So if I just wanted to make the whole piano darker or brighter, I could do that with 1 slider, but in this case, we can do it however you want. It's a bit up to taste. And again, it might depend on stuff like the reverb you're using, the mics you're using on the piano, the model you're playing through. But what that sounds like, let's say we voice this really dark. Now, if we pull all these up, we can get a really bright voicing. And you can hear, even if I play really softly, it's still got that bright attack. Now, I could set this to a really dynamic setting here. I've got the piano and forte both maxed out, and the mezzo I'm going to set right in the middle. And that gives us a really wide dynamic range. If I pulled these up closer to each other, let's set them more towards the middle here. And now we've got a little more tighter dynamic range. And if that's too bright, we could just darken all of these. This again is a matter of taste. It really depends on the production you're working on and the sound you want out of your piano. You might like it really nice and soft. You might want it bright and aggressive. And you can change this, and with MIDI, we can change it after it's recorded too. So you can really just play around with it there and think about those things, the brightness, darkness, as well as the dynamic range that your voicing gives you. Regulation has to do with keeping the piano in good mechanical working order, and that can be done in a variety of methods. Things get out of adjustment. There's a lot of screws in a piano action that can be used to tweak how it responds to the player, and a lot of those can just get out of adjustment over time. There are felts inside the piano that get worn down, and so things need to be kept up and set in the right place so the key responds how you expect it to. Now, in a software like Pianoteq, there really isn't any regulation to speak of. There are some options sound-wise that have to do with the condition of this virtual instrument. You don't need to regulate a piano in Pianoteq. However, if you want it to sound like it's out of regulation, like it's a really worn, beat-up old piano for whatever reason, there are a few things we can do, like increasing the key release noise And I'll demo that. That may be useful in adding a sense of extra realism or intimacy to the piano. I don't really use the damper position or damping duration very much. That is the efficiency of the dampers. I guess if you wanted it to have less efficient dampers, it is possible that the dampers will over time get weaker, and you can simulate that here, but it's not usually something that is particularly sought after. It kind of just makes the piano harder to control, but if you want to. Now, on every piano, the very highest notes don't have dampers. They're just not needed. Those notes aren't as loud or sustained, and so it's not really distracting for them not to have dampers, and it can increase the sympathetic resonance to not have dampers there. So you can change what note the last damper is. Right now, starting at F, I don't have dampers. I can lower that. However, you can hear that on those lower notes, it doesn't really sound all that pleasant. Here, the dampers are all the way up to D sharp. That's way higher than you'd ever see on a piano, but you can hear how it sounds to change that. Again, it's something you should probably just leave on default. Again, the key release noise is probably the most crucial of these settings that you might want to play with. I have built my own custom 3-pedal system with analog pedals. You can see that they're not just up and down. This middle one is, and it's just like a button, but my damper pedal is analog, so it has the full range. Now, one thing I've noticed, one little complaint in Pianoteq, I guess, is that this sustain pedal noise, while it sounds fine on its own, and I'll let you hear it right here. So that's a pretty good sounding sustain pedal noise. It's when all the dampers are lifting out of the strings and they rub the strings just a little bit and sort of activate everything. The problem I have with an analog pedal, of which there's a number out there, is that same sound is triggered at every little change. And if I show you what my MIDI information looks like, you can see that as I move that pedal, it's sending a ton of data. So each time it's moved, you get that sustain pedal noise. And it is sort of louder as you get to the full extent of the range. It seems like it's a little quieter at the top of the range where it's not really doing much. However, if you listen to that on its own, it just sounds very digital and artificial, like it's a sample that's being triggered each time. So I like to lower that below the default if you're using an analog damper pedal. Or you could even turn it off if you just don't like it at all. But it might be nice to keep a little bit in there for realism. As long as it's much quieter down here, like I can talk over that and can't even really hear it, then it's fine to leave some in there. There's also mallet bounce, and bouncing hammers are something that can happen with a poorly regulated piano, specifically if the capstans under the keys are too low, there's lost motion, and basically the hammer is just being allowed to bounce around rather than being really stopped by the action. So we can add that. Again, don't know why you would really want to. This could be useful as almost like a delay effect for unaffected sound. So it does have use, but if we were to just play with these, can be a cool sound for sound design or for maybe emulating a hammered dulcimer. There is a cymbalom that comes with this. So it does have uses, and it is something that can happen on a piano, but it's also usually completely different across the whole keyboard. And so it's usually just a few hammers that might be bouncing, not all of them. And they wouldn't be bouncing in sync with each other because it depends on the weight of the hammer. So it's, again, not a good thing, but an option for making a messed up piano. The easiest of all these is to just throw this condition slider. If you want to make your piano more worn and out of tune, badly regulated, you can just do that right here. And it does get really kind of horror movie pretty quickly, but sometimes setting it just a little bit might give it a little bit of added realism, take some of the perfection out of it. My job is to make pianos sound as good as possible. So stuff like this is a bit amusing, but in the digital world, it's like we're always chasing sometimes things that are more realistic are less perfect, less digital. And it's understandable, but it's similar to debates around preamps and, tubes, analog gear. There's all these plugins that are trying to be analog, and it can be great. It's fun to add in some of that grit that we don't have in the digital world. But, engineers spent decades trying to get noise floors lower, trying to get distortion figures lower on all this, studio equipment. And to now spend money to buy plugins to mess up our perfect gear. Like, we've gotten things so good with digital that we're going the other direction. And you can see sort of some of that with some of these features too. If you think this piano sounds too good and it's unrealistic to have a brand new Steinway D, which it is, I mean, it's like a $250,000 piano, you can make it sound less good. When it comes to any piano software, whether it's Pianoteq or other sample libraries, a lot of the experience and feel and realism comes down to our interface, which is our digital piano. So no matter what software we're using, we need a good interface to use it with, our digital piano. And there are a couple things to pay attention to when picking out a digital piano. The most important thing I would say is to avoid anything that is unweighted or that has a synth action. You can typically spot a synth action by having sort of floating looking keys that stop right below the key top. Those are usually spring-loaded and sometimes are called semi-weighted. I personally don't like them. I don't think they're a good experience for acoustic piano. If you play mostly synthesizers and stuff, that's fine. They can work if you like that, but I don't think they're realistic to the feel of a piano at all. And I had a Korg M50 before, plenty of cool sounds built in. It's got a touchscreen. However, I just hated the action on it, so I sold it. This is a Korg D1. I really like this one. It's the nicest keybed I felt for a digital piano, and I have not played everything that's out there, so I'm not saying it's the best in the world, but I really like it. And this is the RH3 keybed. It's the nicest keybed and action that Korg makes. And this is in its cheapest package. I think these are around $700. Not a ton of features as far as the keyboard controls and sounds, but as far as just a MIDI controller with a really premium keybed, this is a good one. It is a bit heavier than a real piano. This action has graduated weight, which just means that the bass side is heavier, the treble side is lighter. That's another important aspect of realism in a digital piano, and some of the cheapest weighted keyboards won't have graduated weight, which it may be a subtle thing. It's not super important to performance, but from a feel and sort of immersion perspective, I really like having a graduated weighted keyboard. And most of the nicer pianos that you will see out there are all graduated today. In my own home studio, I don't record acoustic piano. However, I work in a lot of recording studios as a piano tuner, so I get to see a lot of different mic setups and mic choices. And so I have some insight onto how you can use the virtual microphones in Pianoteq to get different sounds and more realistic studio-like mic setups. I'm not personally an expert in recording acoustic piano. I don't really do it myself, but I'm around it every week. There are a lot of options in Pianoteq as far as the virtual mics, and that is one of my favorite features of this software, because it's just not something you get in a sample library. You may have different sets of mics that you can balance the levels of, which is cool, and that does maybe much of the same thing, but it's cool to be able to just change the mic type, change the position, play around with how things sound. It can be a good way to learn something about recording an acoustic piano without actually having the piano and the mics in the room with you. It would be cool to have this in sort of a 3D space that you could work in. I mean, it is sort of, but you've just got this top view and this front view, and you can see the overview of the room. It'd be cool to have like a orthographic. We do have some presets here if you want to get a basic setup of these mics. I commonly see spaced pairs, so this AB is typically what I see. And in one of the studios I work at, he's got a cool mic, this microphone bar. I'll try to pull up a picture here. A bar that goes inside the piano that holds microphones, and you can change the width of those. And so recreating something like this, it is a spaced pair. And I know the exact mics we have, which are here. Okay, so I think they're actually the 4006. They are an Omni mic, and that looks to be the same ones we have. So these go in where the piano starts to get a little wider here around the treble string. So usually right kind of in this area inside the piano, which also means we got to bring this down. They go basically just above the strings here. We do use room mics as well, but you can hear how these sound. So that's just those mics. We use those a lot, and if it is like a jazz recording with a full band, we will have the lid closed. And so with the lid closed and inside the piano, probably not exactly analogous to how it sounds in the real world, but that is one cool little thing we have. More commonly, I see pairs outside the piano, and so something like this sort of off the side and typically angled in and not that far off the piano. U87s are a great mic. I don't know if I've actually... I know they are used for recording pianos, but they're very expensive. I don't know that I've personally seen a piano recorded with U87s, but it certainly is done. I'll play and move the mics off the piano so you can kind of hear how it sounds as we change the mic position in real time. Rather than, or in addition to an extra reverb, it would be cool to be able to change the size, the height of the room, the damping of the room, much in the same way you can do in a lot of reverb plugins. And there are some options in the reverb of this. But since we're in this virtual mic room, well, obviously the sound of the mics is going to be greatly affected by the sound of the room. So That is something that would be nice to see in the future. So building on this, if this is our main stereo pair here, it's nice to have some room mics. I know at least in one studio I work at, he likes the ribbons, and it does look, not sure if it is this 84 mic, AEA R84. That's definitely the mic that we use. So yes, that is the same one. So these would typically be set up something like this off the side of the piano, a couple feet off, kind of higher depending on the height of the room, usually just closer to the ceiling, not way too high usually, but somewhere around there. You can sort of follow the angle of the piano lid. I also am not a huge fan of the way the panning in this works. It's not really panning so much as, I mean, it is, but you have to do it by changing the individual volumes of each channel, which makes sense if you're doing like a multi-output thing, but it's not so great for stereo panning. But anyways, so if I want to do this, say I want to hard pan these, I'll turn off this one, and let's set this to -12 and this one to -12. Then we have left and right hard panned room mics, which we probably wouldn't actually hard pan them in this case, but for demonstration. So there we've got a pretty typical recording studio setup. Of course, mic choice is going to be up to you. There's a lot of options. The 4006 is what we use at one studio I work at. The U87 are extremely expensive, but in a bigger studio you might see those. C414s are not quite as out of reach. And then these ribbon mics are also good for a little bit darker sound. There's also the effects section here, which is pretty familiar if you do much music production, but the reverb as well is something we can use to get a more realistic sound. But a lot of these by default, I think the mix is way too high. I don't like the piano to be that wet usually. I think pianos should be dry. Humidity and water are bad for them, so we want to keep the wetness to a minimum. Like this default medium hall, that's just up way too high for my taste. Let's put it down to, say, -20. That might be a little dry if you were actually in the room. Up at -6 here. That sounds pretty good for if you want some of that space there. It's not overpowering, but it's not super dry either. But I would say that's the kind of reverb sound I would probably gravitate towards. We do have things like plates and springs, and you know, you can try it out in a cathedral, but cathedrals aren't really great for recording piano, so it's all useful for sound design. But as far as what would be a realistic piano sound, either in one of these studios, rooms, or, you know, one of these concert halls, a Steinway D is typically seen in a concert hall. But again, I'm going to turn this down. You know, I would say that's about as wet as I would ever want it. You could go a little higher. But if you go too wet, you just end up with not enough definition in the piano. It's a matter of taste. That's my taste. As far as what pianos are most commonly used in recording studios, the number one I've seen is the Steinway Model B, which I don't have a copy of that. I do have the demo mode in this, but I have not bought the Steinway B for Pianoteq. The Steinway D, I've never seen in a typical recording studio. You will get them recorded on a stage, perhaps, at a hall. But inside a studio, they're just a little too big. You know, it's a 9-foot instrument. They can be very brassy, powerful instruments. Good in a concert hall, good for playing with an orchestra, a beautiful instrument, no doubt, and the most expensive piano you can buy, basically. But they're not as common in recording studios. For making records, you'll find the Model B is that's certainly what I've seen as the most common piano for studios. The Yamaha C7 is another good choice. A little less popular. Yamahas can be overly bright, but again, you can change hammers. It's not cheap, but it can be done, and you can also voice them. And I work on a C7 all the time that had its hammers replaced. It's been voiced by a great technician who taught me, and that's a beautiful instrument, and I love it. But the Steinway B is another great choice. And you do see some smaller pianos too, of course, a variety of uprights in smaller studios. There is a Kawai GS30 I work on in a studio, but it's their B piano, and it's not a bad instrument. It could use some work in terms of voicing, I think. I think it's a little too harsh at this point. Any kind of grand, typically for a studio, the 6 foot to 7.5 foot range in terms of length is what produces the best sound in a studio. Too short and you won't get enough bass, enough depth and fullness, and you might start to get some weird overtones. But I think a full concert grand is not as common. Maybe in a studio that's more like a concert hall for classical recordings, you might see a Steinway D, but I've seen Steinway Ds in homes before, and that is a very large piano to put in your house, but it can be done. You won't really get the most out of it because it's a big instrument that needs a big room. That's my recording wisdom for whatever it's worth. So hopefully this gave you some further insight into the workings of acoustic pianos, as well as how to use piano software. It's a huge topic, and this is intended to be more of an overview than anything, but if you do have questions, let me know, and hopefully I'll be able to answer them. As always, please consider liking and subscribing, and I hope to see you in my next video.